All right. What episode 5? I had to double check. This one got rescheduled and then completely remapped and then invited different people. And hey, it's episode 5 of season 16 of Mention and Dispatches. And welcome back, everybody. This episode is brought to you by Ardwulf.
Hi, folks.
Yeah, this was his idea. So we're going to give you a heap and helping of Gary so that I don't have to talk as much, but more importantly, he knows what he wants to talk about. So this is going to be entertaining. It's TTRPGs and Wargames separated at birth.
Right. So I guess what I was thinking about at the time when we had this phone conversation a few days ago was how, as somebody who plays pretty actively both RPGs and war games, and who is aware of the shared roots of RPGs and war games, looking at the state of both areas today, what things do they have in common? They used to have a lot in common, right? Mm-hmm. And for at least several years after the first commercial RPG, Dungeons and Dragons, was released, it wasn't at all uncommon to hear RPGs described as fantasy war games, right? Even though there were already like fantasy war games that were just kind of strictly miniatures games.
That was the cover of the original D&D.
That's true, and that was in the subtitle of the original D&D brown box with the fascinating contact paper cover.
Yeah. That was also a famously impenetrable early 80s RPG rulebook called Fantasy Wargaming from some guys over in England.
Shall I pull it off the shelf to show it off?
No, we don't record the video, so...
That's true.
No.
But I still have my original copy of Bruce Galloway, who apparently tragically passed away a few years later in a car accident. It isn't a book that is simultaneously like source book for medieval role-playing and attempt to adapt a more historical paradigm of the supernatural into fantasy RPGs and a virtually unplayable actual fantasy TTRPG system.
Yeah. The rules were crap, but as I recall, some of the medieval setting information was reasonably good.
It was, and there was a whole chapter on inspirational fantasy literature, which yes. I'm not sure that there's anything in that book that I hadn't read by the end of the 80s.
Yeah.
And that was an important list for me.
Yeah. The amusing part, of course, is that it was called Fantasy Wargaming, and anybody today taking a look at that's going, that's a role-playing game. But part of this gets back into defining, what is a war game? What is a role-playing game? What is a fill-in-the-blank game? And all of the attendant arguments that belong with those discussions.
Yeah, and I'm not terribly interested in trying to outline or figure out formal definitions for either of these things. We've already solved that for wargaming, as you know. And for RPGs, I'm just going to presume that everybody listening knows what we mean by RPGs. If you think of Dungeons and Dragons, you're probably right. And if you have no idea what we're talking about, go watch Critical Role on YouTube, and that will more or less show you what the deal is.
Yeah. Not to veer too far off into those definitional discussions, but the one thing to me that has always been the thing that you absolutely, where RPGs separate themselves from everything else, is the idea of the improvability of your characters in game, and that they are not fixed static things, that they have the ability to change over time. And that's that there are a lot of adventure games that have very role-playing like elements to them, but they essentially reset to the what's the term? Status quo ante, I think, is the term that the television guys use, right? Everything goes back to the way it was at the start of the episode. That's every time you open the box, that's where you are. Whereas I think the intent with the what we generally conceptualize role-playing games is the idea that there is continual, not that there has to be, but that there is the possibility of continual improvement of your in-game characters as you play. And to me, that's been the key thing that always set them apart whenever I was talking with other people about them. And that's something that's missing from the vast majority of war games.
Yes, and I would agree with you that that's traditionally been something that I've closely associated with RPGs as well. But I can think of numerous exceptions. An early example might be Dawn Patrol from TSR, which I would call a war game with a campaign mode. It is a World War I biplane dogfighting game.
Yep.
But I would also point to more recent examples like The Hunters, where you can just play like one mission if you want, but you hang that captain and that boat. And there is potential progression built into the system, and a lot of the war games that have sort of the shared DNA of B-17 Queen of the Skies have that feature nowadays. At least a lot of the modern ones do. I've actually never played B-17 Queen of the Skies. I don't know if it had a campaign mode in it or not.
I've not played it either. I know plenty of people who have. The impression I got is that it is fairly well on rails. But again, I'm taking that from other people since I have not personally played it.
Yeah, and I know that people do play it in a campaign mode, whether that is actually in the box or not.
Yes.
So
yeah, but I think part of that goes back to what are you expecting when you open the box? But even with Queen of the Skies, I think there's some incremental improvements as you go, but at a certain point, you're sort of capped out by what's in the box. And, and you know, limited setting and whatever. But that may be part of where we get into that crossover territory that Rocky likes to talk about with the adventure war game, right? The hybrid that exists between TTRPGs and war games.
Yeah, I think this is another game I have not personally played, but I believe that it's probably accurate to say that there are some role-playing elements in Ambush, for example, either directly explicit in the rules or just as a de facto way that people play it, where you have a squad of soldiers and there are individual pieces that you move around, and you are, I think there's a natural instinct to name those people, right? Here's Sergeant Butch, that kind of thing, and give them some personality. And that's something that people have been doing for decades, and which we can see now to some extent in like War Game live plays of certain games on YouTube, right? Stuka Joe has a very famous, at this point, playthrough of B-17 Queen of the Skies, where he named all the crew on the B-17, and it was a tremendously engaging to watch. In part because of that, because his game allowed, and recording production of it allowed for characterization of that crew had character, right? And of course, they were all the crew members were named after well-known at the time wargaming YouTubers.
Yeah, Eckenfels did that with one of his. It was a B-17, B-24, one of those solo procedural aviation games where he named all the crew after dragoons, and
I myself have been the victim of this treatment at least once.
Well, Mike Colello did that with a zombie game where he had Grant and Alexander, and I think you and me, and Liz was in there from Beyond Solitaire, and maybe Mo was in there. I don't remember for sure. I don't remember everybody he had in there, but it was a bunch of wargaming media folks.
So that's an obvious, it's probably a definitional outlier, because those games don't necessarily tell you to do that. But people have nevertheless been doing that for a long time. We also have games like Republic of Rome, which is mostly a political game with a military element, but in which you are, playing Roman senatorial factions. Yeah. And you are encouraged when the voting happens to stand up and give a speech. That's in the book. And it's a tremendous game if you have not played the classic Avalon Hill Republic of Rome. It was later redone by somebody, Valley Games, I think. And there's a couple other games that were heavily influenced by Republic of Rome as well. I think one of the two games called Founding Fathers might be one of those.
I think Phalanx has one that's loosely based on that, but don't hold me to that. GMT's Rise of the Roman Republic, I do not think follows that lineage.
No, indeed it does not.
So don't, similar names, different thing.
That game has an entirely different definition of character than that, but it is a fabulous war game. Both the games in that series are really good.
So going back to the idea of TTRPGs and war games being separated at birth, we quipped accurately as it is that the original first printings of D&D, the OD&D, whatever you want to call it, the original white box, brown box versions had a thing on there about rules for fantasy war games with pencil and paper or something to that. I don't remember the exact verbiage,
something like that.
But it did say for fantasy war games, and at some point, that idea of the fantasy war game became the role playing game. Now, obviously, when these guys are first creating the original role-playing game, they're not thinking, oh, hey, this is the role-playing game. Like that's something that grew up later. But at some point, where you and I were growing up, because we are of a similar age.
Right, in the late Pleistocene.
Yes, rapidly approaching really damn old. As we were growing up, these were all just adventure games or hobby games. It was just one general thing. And whether you were, look, TSR published Wargames and role-playing games, and then they published even more war games after they bought SPI. Avalon Hill dipped their toe into the war game, or into the role-playing game realm briefly, and then ended up buying the rights to RuneQuest, and then
licensing the right. Well, I think it was actually a purchase of partial rights, the rights to the system, but not to the setting, as I recall.
I think that's what it was. GDW famously managed to keep feet firmly planted in both worlds for a long time, and fairly well. So, I mean, this is something that the companies themselves, West End Games, was firmly planted in both worlds for a long time. This is something that folks have done and done well in the past. But at some point, the two communities got pretty well bifurcated to the point where today they don't get along at all. And the gaming omnivores like you and me, I think, are far more rare than common anymore these days. And if
wargaming is one of them, I would agree with you.
I have my theories as to when and where and why and how that split really... It's the old famous, you get a crack in the tree trunk and you don't see the crack at first, and then it slowly starts to widen, and then suddenly the crack in the tree trunk is the dominant thing that the tree's going to follow at any moment. It's not like there was one moment where you point to and go, well, that's when it happened, but it does evolve over time until at a certain point you're looking at it and going, holy shit, there's a schism.
Yeah.
What is your thought as to when and where and why and how that might have happened? Well, not might have, it did happen, but why?
I think the formal split probably happens in around 1980, say plus or minus a year or two. Because even into the early 80s, we had role-playing games that were very war game-like. And just even today, just as we see wargamers inserting some light role-playing elements into their war games, I mean, who hasn't been playing the British in a Battle of Britain game and busted out the Churchill voice? Right. At the same time, there's probably D&D players out there who play D&D very much like a tactical war game. It's certainly, depending on the edition of D&D, it's very easy to do that. 4th edition, 3rd edition, very easy to play them as basically tactical skirmish fantasy war games.
Yeah, 4th edition especially.
With or without miniatures, I note.
Yeah, 4th is a lot harder to do without at least some form of map in front of you, whether you put minis on it or not, just because of the way that all the combat is written. 3rd, you could get away with it. It's not easy, but it's doable. 4th, it's damn near impossible without a map grid in front of you.
Yeah, but even back in the AD&D days, there were certainly people who basically played it like that, with or without miniatures, right?
Yeah.
And, I got a buddy locally here who is talking about running Adventures Dark and Deep, which is Joe Block's really nice evolution of AD&D. And he runs to this day, stuff very tactically. It's always very combat forward.
Yeah.
I mean, you have opportunities to talk your way out of the combats or sneak your way around the combats or whatever, or poison the dungeon inhabitants or burn the fortress to the ground. For example, we had a very famous incident back in the day. This would have been early 80s, where somebody had set up the steadying of the Hill Giant Chief, and the player said, that's a huge wooden stockade type building, let's burn it down. And they burned it down. Adventure over.
Yeah, pretty quick. So you're thinking it was 1980 or very shortly thereafter, and what do you think the general cause of that might have been?
Bitterness.
Okay.
There was at the time a perception among wargamers, as I recall, that these new fantasy wargaming things, whatever we're calling them, are really a different kind of thing than the traditional war games, whether miniatures or hex and counter, that they were used to. And that is not a groundless position to have. If we think about RPGs, which are generally genre-based, right, whether it's fantasy, sci-fi, superheroes, horror, whatever it is, And contrast that with war games, which almost entirely are either historical or at least pseudo-historical. There are certainly examples of
Bomba
fantasy.
exists.
Well, that's true too. But there's certainly many examples of sci-fi and fantasy war games. There's probably at least a superhero game out there somewhere that I would probably say is kind of wargaming. I mean, HeroClix is actually kind of wargaming, to be honest.
Yeah. So you're thinking bitterness in the early 80s as wargamers looked at these new things and said, fuck them.
Well, maybe. And, a lot of those wargamers back in the 70s probably tried D&D and it just didn't work for them, or they became D&D players or hybrid players who played both games. I think over time, individual gamers of whatever stripe will tend to specialize. I have absolutely done that. I used to be a very wide-ranging RPG consumer, and I have in the last several years, I have limited my focus and purchasing to a pretty small number of game systems that I like, which is not to say I never buy anything at random. I totally do, but if I think I can get something out of it and use it in Traveler, then yeah, I'll probably buy that. I've got several games that were purchased for exactly that reason. A distinction that has grown up, and we societally have seen this phenomenon before. For example, in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, starting to get into the 1940s, there was not a strong distinction between fantasy as a literary genre and science fiction. It wasn't really until John W. Campbell became the editor of Astounding. I don't remember when that was off the top of my head, but late 30s, mid 30s, something like that. And he really pushed science fiction as like a definitional thing, and he had a platform from which to expound on that, and he did in his legendarily opinionated and sometimes totally imbecilic essays that appeared in each issue of the magazine. But prior to that, it was just kind of weird fiction, right? And there wasn't like a sharp distinction necessarily drawn between the stuff Robert E. Howard was writing and the stuff that H.P. Lovecraft was writing and the stuff that guys like Jack Williamson or Edmund Hamilton were writing. And over time, though that single broad category became kind of codified in the published imagination as multiple separate categories, where now we have the science fiction side and the fantasy side and the horror side. And prior to that, there was not a strong definitional divergence between those three things.
I think the more content of a certain form you create, the more of it people want to put in particular boxes and try and draw circles around. When you've only got 10 of something, it's very easy to say that, oh yeah, that is all speculative fiction. But once you get to the point where you've got like 10 each of horror and sci-fi and fantasy, well, now maybe we need to start delineating a little more. Some of it's probably marketing. Some of it's probably just the editors trying to keep things straight in their head. But I think the more of something you have, the more natural desire there is to try and draw those loops around them somehow.
I think market forces are definitely a factor. We might stretch our literary analog here to the early 1970s, where The Lord of the Rings had exploded in popularity on college campuses and elsewhere in the US, UK, and elsewhere. And there was an untapped market that was identified by somebody like Terry Brooks or Judy Lindell Ray, who ran Ballantyne's sci-fi publishing arm for a while, and then was really the senior guiding force behind Del Rey Books for the first several years of its existence. She published Terry Brooks. It was the novels are not that great, but they were a big hit, and their success helped other early, I guess we'll say early late fantasy, right? Because there's plenty of fantasy before 1970, but it really brought fantasy out as a publishing genre. And then we started to see on the spines of the books, Bantam Books, fantasy, or Bantam Books, science fiction, or whatever. Yeah. So the publication information also helped to separate those genres and the communities that were attached to or fans of those genres, and helped to kind of lock those very loose definitions in. And I think that we probably saw similar feature in gaming, right? Because early on, a lot of the early role-playing games were sold as wargaming this or wargaming that, whereas by the early 80s, that had pretty much ceased, and they started to be referred to, at least in my recollection, almost universally as role-playing games. And of course, when I started role-playing games in 1981, which was after I started wargaming, by the way, that terminology had at least started to become pretty entrenched.
Yeah. I started role-playing about the same time. And again, it was after I had started wargaming. I've said, I've talked about it numerous times, so I won't rehash it too much here. But
Same.
My dad was a wargamer. When I was growing up, I wanted to be cool and push counters around with Dad. And so that's how I got started wargaming. My dad never picked up on role-playing at all. He would humor me when I was in, 4th, 5th, 6th grades and wanted to practice being a DM, that my dad would humor me and play along, but it was clearly not something that he was all that into, and not something he ever did on his own. And so early 80s is when I got introduced. It was 81. It was when we were living in California, that some friends of mine in the housing area there on the base introduced me to role-playing games. The first one was actually a very bastardized Tunnels and Trolls.
Oh, that's interesting. And unusual. There's a hilarious, I think it's hilarious, story by Ken St. Andre, the designer of Tunnels and Trolls, which was the second role-playing game ever published, as far as I can tell. There's some dispute about that, whether that was released prior to Empire of the Petal Throne or not. But at this point, my research indicates that it was actually Tunnels and Trolls. Ken's out in California, and the TSR people are up in Wisconsin. So the people playing in the Midwest generally learned how to play from people who had already played. And Gary's kind of influence in running it, and the people around Gary who would run games for people, for years at Gary's house, for example, his basement is famous to this day. Then you had Ken, who gets a copy of the rule book, and he's out in California and he has his D&D rules and says, "Oh, this is exploding in popularity. What the hell is this? I cannot find an actual game in here. I have no idea how to actually play this." So he pretty much redesigned it from the ground up to get Tunnels and Trolls. And considering how early Tunnels and Trolls was, 1975, it's really remarkably different from D&D. We would not see another game that was more different than D&D until 1977 with Traveler. Everything prior to that, with the exception of Tunnels and Trolls, and several of them are interesting in their own right. Boot Hill has some, people are interested in Boot Hill to some extent. We're actually running a Boot Hill Braunstein, which is another word that we should drop into this conversation.
Yeah, we'll get there.
On my Discord, on the Ardwulf Discord community, and that's going very well. You had Empire of the Petal Throne, which is basically D&D mechanically, but it's got this very intricate setting that much of which is imparted in that original box set with beautiful maps and all that. It's beautiful by 1975 standards. Whereas when you started to see, we started to hit 1979, 1980, 1981, we started to see a lot of different stuff. We started to see the superhero games. I think Champions was 82 or 83. Call of Cthulhu was 83-ish. RuneQuest, of course, pops in 1978, and that is vastly different mechanically from D&D, and has even though in the first edition there's a kind of an implied setting, Glorantha, which was further developed in great detail over the subsequent years.
Well, and for those that don't know or don't remember, Glorantha actually predated the RuneQuest rules.
True.
So
as did Tekamel, predating the Empire of the Petal Throne game.
Predated the original D&D rules, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And both games, both RuneQuest and Empire of the Petal Throne, were considered scandalously expensive at various times.
Yeah.
I think the original 1975 box set for EPT was something like $30, which is like an astronomical amount of money.
It's like $220 today or something.
Yeah. And RuneQuest 3rd edition, which was the version of RuneQuest that Avalon Hill did, which is what introduced me to RuneQuest formally. There's a book called Dicing with Dragons by Ian Livingstone, one of the founders of Games Workshop. That was another kind of there you go. I get kind of an early influence. I've recently recently as in the last 3 years, reacquired a copy on eBay for a pretty good price. Same with the complete Wargames.
That's mine from 83. That's the same one I've been toting around since 83.
And it has a big list of role-playing games that were around at the time, and I forget what the actual publication date of this thing was, and with little one-paragraph summaries of what they are and what they're doing and how they're different and all that stuff. But we got deep dives into a number of the really popular role-playing games at the time, which were D&D, RuneQuest, Tunnels and Trolls, Traveler, and there may have been another one that I can't remember.
Those four. It was the big four.
So at the time, by the time I got my hands on that book, I had already been exposed to Traveller and D&D, but this RuneQuest thing sure sounded interesting, but I had never seen it in a game store here in Ohio until Avalon Hill was kind enough to bring it to us around 1986, 1987, something like that.
I think it was a little before that, but close enough.
All right, something like that. I may be mixing it up with Advanced Squad Leader, too, as far as release date goes, which was 85. So I picked up, and it was scandalously expensive at the time. So I actually, for those of a certain vintage will remember when in an Avalon Hill game, you would get the little brochure of individual game parts you could order piece by piece. That is how my original RuneQuest set was assembled or I ordered the player's book and the magic book. And then at a later time, I ordered the 3 Game Master facing books.
For that original Tunnels and Troll stuff. So again, this is 4th grade for me, and playing with other 3rd, 4th, 5th grade friends that were there in the neighborhood. That the original version that I was introduced to was based primarily on the Tunnels and Trolls mechanics, with a heavy dose of Saturday morning cartoons, with a whole lot of Thundar the Barbarian and Black Star, and there was a lot of that influencing it. And then I probably picked up D&D within a month of that first role-playing experience there, just because that's what it was. I don't recall this at the time because my attendance at game conventions didn't start until the 90s. But I do, since then, going back and looking through some of the histories of the different game conventions, it's funny that you can find program descriptions from 82, 83, 84 timeframe in the Origins program, that there was a seminar of, role-playing games and why it's awful that they're taking over our wargame conventions or something to that effect. And it was very clear that folks weren't thrilled with them. But I think you still had enough people that had feet firmly planted in both camps, that gamers like you and me and publishers like West End and GDW and 3W and some others that still had feet firmly planted in both camps, that you had plenty of games still going, or plenty of support still going for folks, whether you were playing role-playing stuff or whether you were playing wargame stuff, or whether you were kind of hybridizing them, the Striker rules from Traveller, for instance. I mean, they weren't just from Traveller, but really intended to be the ground combat equivalent of Traveller, or Nighthawks for Star Frontiers. Because Nighthawks was a standalone space combat war game, but was designed to be integrated into Star Frontiers as an RPG.
There are actually tons of examples of that. Some surprisingly recent. We've got all the stuff that DreamPod 9 did, for example, with the possible exception of Trive 8, also had like a separate war game you could play in those science fiction settings. Heavy Gear, and the one I liked from DreamPod 9 was Jovian Chronicles, actually. So, and I actually ran that briefly, and there are several amusing anecdotes that arose from that brief campaign, however brief. To me, I think so. The idea of the gamer playing the individual person, that one-on-one person out there. You mentioned the Brownstein thing earlier. That those grew out of some things Dave Arneson was doing in Minnesota, on roughly a parallel track with Gary Gygax, and we're not going to rehash all the histories of it. Go read Shannon Appleklein's books. Go read John Peterson. John Peterson's Playing Up the World would be the marquee book on this particular topic, on how D&D specifically emerged from the wargaming scene of the late 60s and early 70s.
There's that. The Elusive Shift has some of this in it also.
Also by Peterson.
And so there are other places that you can find that, but the idea of this is your individual avatar. So you are playing a unit of one running around the battlefield, and not necessarily having to engage in combat, because there's these other things that happen in between all the shooty bangy stuff. And thus the role playing game was born, right? You're now playing a role, trying to do other things as a part of this. To me, though, the part where the market, as much as any anything gets segmented to where people start very hard coming down on one side or the other. From my seat, and again, I've talked about it before. Look, I lived in Europe in a bunch of the 80s, and for us, the games were, what did they happen to have in stock at the store on the base this week?
Yeah.
Or what was I able to mail order? What did somebody bring back from the States with them?
This will seem very alien to your typical millennial gamer.
Yes, no kidding. You could occasionally find stuff in a German store off base somewhere that was an English language game that would have some translated stuff with it, but maybe not all of it. So you could find some of the old Beckme box sets in stores in the German towns that had some of the stuff in photocopied, stapled stuff that they would hand to you when you bought the game. Again, most folks in Germany would start, they started taking English classes in school starting in like 4th grade. So they were literate enough to parse through how to play the game from the English language boxes. But it's now known as it's the Dark Eyes, the English
Der Schwarze Auge.
Yeah, Der Schwarze Auge. I've got boxes on my shelf of Der Schwarze Auge products. I've got those going back to the mid 80s that I bought when I was in Germany back then, and I've still got some of those. But you sort of got what was on the shelf. And Dragon Magazine at the time still had Wargames stuff alongside role-playing stuff throughout the mid and late 80s. TSR obviously is publishing some SPI stuff where they had purchased SPI. So you're getting TSR Wargames, and you've got Wargame ads in Dragon Magazine.
Up through the early 90s.
Yes, up through the early 90s. But you had consistent, regular Wargame support in the flagship magazine out there for the role-playing industry's flagship magazine. Even Steve Jackson with Space Gamer Fantasy Gamer is still covering Wargame stuff because they publish some Wargame things alongside their role-playing games. It's really only the general where you're not finding role-playing material at all. To me, where the big schism happened was in the early 90s when White Wolf got the World of Darkness games out there into the mass market. I know the World of Darkness games had sort of started trickling out in the late 80s. It was really the early 90s when you could find them on lots of shelves. And I think
Walden Books.
Yeah, well, you could find all kinds of stuff at Walden Books, but you were starting to see World of Darkness stuff pop up. I don't know that they were ever in like a Walmart or Target kind of place.
Not that I don't think either of those establishments existed in Ohio at the time.
Could be. But the World of Darkness games, as I recall, and not just me, but talking with other folks, friends of mine and gamers that I knew from other places. And again, being in the military, you meet a lot of people that end up in a lot of different places. So you keep in touch with your game friends and you get a lot of stories from around a lot of different places. World of Darkness brought in two big populations relative to what you had before that. One, women. There were a whole lot of ladies that, as I recall, started playing role-playing stuff more after the World of Darkness games came out. I mean, there weren't any. There were women playing role-playing games before that. And war games before that, and designing stuff before that. The percentage of them seemed to go way up after the World of Darkness games came out. And I think the fact that they came out at a comparable time when some popular fantasy novels were taking off that had similar material. Some of the urban fantasy, spellcasters in the modern era, not Harry Potter, but other urban fantasy stories, but also a bunch of the vampire stories. Anne Rice novels.
Right.
Really
Anne Rice was hugely impactful on that early vampire scene.
Yep. And so there were a lot of folks that were reading Anne Rice novels that found out, hey, there's a game that I can play some of this stuff. That's cool. So that was a big part of it, was the subject matter and material brought in a new audience. But the other thing is that a lot of the World of Darkness, the scenarios, the modules, the material, the storylines, and many of the imitators that tried to follow in their footsteps in the early and mid 90s de-emphasized combat. The idea of we're going to go through this mission, and in this encounter we're going to have this fight, and in this encounter we're going to have this fight, and in this encounter we're going to try and get some information out of somebody. If they won't tell us, we'll beat it out of them. So we could still end up in a fight. That a lot of those D&D modules, if you go through them, the locations and the procedure that you go through, the process you go through for the adventure is a whole lot of, we go from this fight to this fight to this other fight to this next fight.
And a trap in there somewhere.
Yeah, there's a trap in there somewhere, but there's still physical damage as a result of all of this. And the stories that you were not just able to tell, but in many cases were encouraged to tell through the World of Darkness games and a variety of their imitators, de-emphasized combat, or in many cases, combat was detrimental to what you were trying to accomplish. There were World of Darkness scenarios where if you got in a fight, you were dead really fast because you're picking a fight with somebody who's way stronger than you. You've got to find a way to still accomplish your goals without getting in a fight. And I think the point at which you could now go into a role-playing game without having to hack and slash your way through it, and you were bringing in an audience that was far more steeped in literature than history, and for whom the lack of hack and slash was a feature, not a bug. I think that's where I saw the split become far, far more pronounced. The people that were shopping in the stores that had both, if they were going to the role-playing stuff and when they accidentally saw the wargame aisle, turned around and sprinted the other direction, were the folks looking for World of Darkness and those kinds of offshoots. Whereas the wargamers, they might drift into some D&D stuff. They're fine with Twilight 2000. There's probably some overlap in the Star Wars world. But other than that, man, I ain't going anywhere near that World of Darkness stuff. I don't get to shoot anybody. So to me, that's where I saw the split happen.
Season 16 of Mentioned in Dispatches is underway, and we couldn't do it without our Patreon supporters, and especially the regimental captains at the top level. The Armchair Dragoons would like to thank Chris Anthony, James M., Brian Silcott, Chet Bell, Joseph Knorr, Paul LaFontaine, Miles R., Staggerwing, Fred's Dog, and Fred 2, Kevin Bertram, Michael Sunborg, Patrick Garrity, Catastrophe Games, Hethwell Wargames, and Greg from Pico Armor. They help us to keep our objectives in our line of sight. You too can support the Regiment of Strategy Gaming as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/armchairdragoons.
My personal, that's anecdotal, but
absolutely.
my anecdote would align pretty closely with that kind of demographic shift around that time in role-playing games. And I do think that we may have, had definitions of this is a role-playing game versus this is a war game. Prior to that, we did. Yeah. But I do think that was a major factor in crystallizing those boundaries within the fan community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I no disagreement at all. And again, you mentioned, anecdotally, that's all I got to go by, right? This is pure anecdote. I would be interested in some deeper exploration of it sometime. Put it on my list of things to do, because it's not like that's a short list. It's one of those. Yeah, eventually, if I get a research assistant, I'll have them go look into it. But it's it is something that I observed, but was also able to bounce off a variety of other people in other places. And I think that's one of the key differences between the folks that grew up in the military and a lot of the other folks that didn't move around as much. I know there's folks that weren't in the military that still moved around a bunch, right? I got friends whose dads worked for IBM that moved around a bunch. But the folks that were more mobile got to observe a lot more gaming communities, not just role playing, a lot more gaming communities in a lot more places than folks that, sort of grew up within a 30, 40 mile radius of where they were born.
Yeah. And I'm definitely in that latter category. Yeah. My visibility on the broader gaming community was limited to what I was reading in Dragon magazine starting in about 1982.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was the only, again, the internet was for those science eggheads at the DoD, and it wasn't something that was mass popularized enough that other folks could futz with it. You got a very narrow view of the world. You got what you could see through some of those magazines, or what some friends happen to tell you about, or if you moved to a new town, you got to see something different. But other than that, man, it was limited info.
Yeah, and we should, I guess this is a general caveat, we shouldn't assume that our experiences back in those days are necessarily either universal or complete, right?
Oh, God, no.
And it probably took me quite a while to figure that out. But, and that has come from conversation with people in the decades since then.
Yeah.
So my question for you, and I may have asked you this in the past, is during the time you spent in Germany, did you have any exposure to the outstanding German translation of Traveller?
No.
Philistine.
Sorry. So I played a little bit of Star Frontiers briefly in California shortly before I left, because that was what we could get at the stores there. Because places that are carrying TSR stuff are carrying all the TSR stuff. I knew of Traveler. I had seen folks play it. I'd seen, a bunch of the stuff on the shelf. But even Star Frontiers, I had to kind of be prodded into playing a little bit. The sci-fi stuff, I enjoyed reading sci-fi stuff. I enjoyed watching sci-fi stuff on TV and in movies. But it wasn't a key gaming experience for me. And so, over in Europe, like, we never saw the Traveler stuff in the on-post stores in the military exchanges at all. Not saying it wasn't there, just we never saw it. Even RuneQuest, you almost never saw. Once Avalon Hill started distributing it, you could find an occasional thing here and there, but not much. You got a Heap and Help and a TSR, and you got some of the SPI stuff, TSR and before. So, I saw a Universe before I saw Traveler over in Europe.
That's an interesting data point. So let's circle back.
Because it was an SPI product, right? I mean, it's already in the SPI ecosystem.
Designed by John Butterfield.
Yeah. No so less. When SPI is sending boxes of stuff to end up in the Stars and Stripes bookstores or in the military exchanges, they're throwing their role-playing game stuff in there alongside, whatever other boxes of stuff they've got. So
sure.
Whereas GDW didn't have that kind of distribution originally. As I recall, GDW, the first GDW thing I remember seeing on a store shelf was Twilight 2000, which is, you can imagine, you got kind of a target market there of military in Europe.
Yeah, who are literally there at the time. This could happen next week.
These guys are the subject of the game.
Right.
Which is why, as I've mentioned before, like Twilight 2000 is one of the very few games out there ever in which we could legitimately stat out ourselves and have them be a plausible character in the game.
Yeah, and it would totally work, especially if yourselves are
a bunch of teenagers living in Germany, like, living out your Red Dawn fantasy in a foreign language. But like... we could create stats for ourselves in T2K, and it made perfect sense within the game.
And I think there was a tactical board game / war game version of Twilight 2002 that GDW put out back in the day.
It was a part of the first battle series that Team Yankee was also a part of.
Okay.
It overlapped with that.
Okay. This was not exactly the apex of war games from GDW, in my opinion, but
no,
I haven't played any of those late GDW war games, with the exceptions of the Third World War series, Ambush, and that was it.
Ambush was Victory Games.
Not Ambush. Assault.
Yeah. Very different systems, obviously.
Quite.
But yeah, there was it was a simplified version of the first battle series that was designed to you could use other first battle components with that light T2K war game, but really it was there in service of the RPG.
Yeah, we might see it as an attempt to bridge the gap in some ways, and of course GDW had a long history of this. I think they even did a board game. I wouldn't call it a war game, but I haven't played it, with Dark Conspiracy as well. And they definitely did, and they were definitely war games for Space 1889. Yep. Even far more recently, however, we have seen things like Falling Stars from Lock and Load, which is both in one box, a tactical war, science sci-fi war game, and an RPG with setting.
And sadly has been discontinued, which is unfortunate, because the opening 4 to 5 pages of the setting backstory, God, there's like 18 plot hooks in there.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's actually pretty good.
Oh, heck yeah. Yeah, it is unfortunate that one did not take off better. It came down to product support, right? And I'm sure we could have a conversation with David at some point about, hey, David, what the hell? But I think it was something that he may have inherited with the purchase of the company. I don't know that for certain.
Oh, maybe.
But its execution under David was fantastic. It's a great book. It's incredibly well written. It's the backstory and the world in which it takes place is phenomenal. And it is interesting that it's a bit of a hybrid. Like you said, it has both the war game and the role-playing game sides of it in there. Not unlike BattleTech and MechWarrior existing in the same universe. But it never found an audience, and maybe that was some schizophrenia, right? They didn't know.
BattleTech's another touch point for this conversation, actually. I think you did hit on a very interesting point, which is I think that certainly nowadays, the expectation for an RPG is we're going to have this RPG and here's the core package, whatever it is. And then we are going to support that with world books or adventures or, but there will be support. Whereas with a war game, the wargamer consumer expectation is, I got this new war game. Cool. And that's it. Right? Because unless it's ASL or a relatively small number of other sort of product families like that, the expectation is that the game is the game, and you're not going to get expansion. Certainly, there are plenty of exceptions to that, especially nowadays where we've seen there's 3 expansions for Fire in the Lake alone.
Yeah.
But that's not really the norm in wargaming. Like when you look at a large number of titles, that's something that GMT tends to do in particular.
Well, I think so. One, I think wargamers expect a complete product in the box.
Yes,
which
including dice. They get very, very grumpy if there's no dice in the box.
Which that sounds like a no shit sort of statement of they expect a complete product in a box, but that hasn't always been the case.
Oh yeah, the examples are too numerous to list this evening.
Yeah, and where there are expansions or sequels, I think more often than not what wargamers are looking for is another complete game in a separate box that uses the same rule set, so there's less lift on learning it, but I'm still getting a complete and an example is the Simonage games, right? Italy 43, Stalingrad 42, Ardennes 44, Holland 44. Every one of those is a standalone complete individual game. They all use basically the same rule system. There are some variations on the theme.
There's enough variations for it to be annoying.
Yeah, well, but if you know one, the time to learn the next one isn't that big.
Yes.
There are the series of games that were designed intentionally as series, like ASL, like Lock and Load Tactical, that have their expansions and add-ons and whatever. And you're going to have a variety of complete standalone boxes, but there's also an assumption that the consumer probably has a bunch of those standalone boxes and doesn't need them all, doesn't need it over and over again just to play some additional battles, which is where you get all the different expansion packs from. Now, you have the occasional folks out there like Avalanche Press and their Panzer Grenadier series who take that to ridiculous extremes, because in order to play all the scenarios in this box, you need your Panzer Grenadier rules. It's an expansion for this one thing, but you need these 2 vehicle counters from this 3rd product, another 3 vehicle counters from this 4th product, and then you need this special leader from this 5th product. And if you want to play them all, it's just one of those things that, if you're a Panzer Grenadier fan, you better have them all if you want to play whatever's coming out next. Otherwise, there's going to be a scenario in that box you can't play.
Yeah, plus there have been different versions of like the core Panzer Grenadier set, which have been called different things, and it's actually a really confusing landscape to operate in. That said, Panzer Grenadier does have its fans.
Yeah, and ASL's been like that on and off throughout the years as well, right?
Yeah,
Mostly on. Yeah, well, but never mind the starter kits. If I wanted to start regular, basic, plain ASL, what's the first box I buy?
You need a rulebook and Beyond Valor.
Yeah, maybe, but is there, that gets me, what
that gets you Western Germans, front? Russians, and the marker set.
Okay, so that gets you Germans, and, Russians, and
about 9 boards in the current edition of Beyond Valor.
So if I don't care about the Russians and I want to play West Front stuff, what do I go get?
You will need the rulebook, Beyond Valor, and either or both of Yanks or For King and Country.
Yeah. So, but we're already starting to stack them up.
Yes, indeed we are.
Yeah.
Much less if you want the Japanese, you buy this set. If you want the Chinese and the U.S. Marines, you have to buy this other set.
Yeah.
Which has been streamlined now into a single Pacific box set called Rising Sun.
Yeah, Combat Commander's gotten a little better about consolidating boxes, especially with the new 20th edition, 20th.
Yeah, which incorporates the entire Mediterranean box as well.
Yep. So there's some combination there, but there's a lot of those games that you've got the standalone battle, and if you've got the expansion, you mentioned Fire in the Lake's got a couple of expansions. Basically, those add years to the start and finish of the game. There aren't a whole lot of coin games with a lot of expansions to them. Cuba Libre has the Calixto Bot expansion to it, which by the time people are listening to this, we will have had an article on the site about that bot. That is as much for the bots as it is any expansion of material. But there aren't a lot of those out there. There's no expansion to Just of Robin Hood. It's
that's not a coin game, but there is an expansion for Falling Sky. There is an expansion coming for the British Way.
Yep.
And I think there's a second Cuba Libre bot that's been cooking to cover the earlier part of the Cuban Revolution.
Could be.
That I think has been stuck in development hell for some time. At least that's my recollection.
Yeah. But you're right in that RPG folks sort of expect a continual flow of product support. Whether you as a consumer choose to jump on that train or not is up to you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas wargamers expect there not to be a continual stream of product support. That, hey, I've got my game. It better be complete in this box. If I want an expansion, I'll look into that later. But
if it's not, I'm sure as hell going to complain about it.
Whereas the role-playing guys sort of get mad if there's not more material forthcoming for the game.
Yeah, which is, a kind of a lack of vision and ambition on the part of RPG players, in my opinion. I think you could play a completely awesome game out of just a core book. And in many cases, I think that is the optimal way to proceed. I have two additional observations regarding the divide between war games and role-playing games. One is just the observation that it seems to me that the most obvious thing separating the two is the emphasis on history. There are a number of examples of historical RPGs. None of them have ever really been immensely popular. Probably the most popular has been the endless sequence of GURPS supplements that came out for Imperial Rome or the Aztecs or Japan or China or whatever, that people then mined for use in whatever it was they were doing, whether it was GURPS or not.
Yeah.
And we have seen I think, comparably small number of flatly non-historical war games, right? Meaning mostly science fiction and fantasy games. But there's some weird oddballs out there, too, like Time Tripper.
Yeah.
The second observation, or really question I would ask, and this is hypothetical because I didn't know Dave Arneson. I never had any contact with Dave Arneson. Never met him, none of that. So that's why I picked him for the purposes of this illustration. Do we suppose that when Dave Arneson shows up at Dave Wesley's house to do some miniature wargaming, but Dave Wesley busts out this Braunstein thing that is nominally Napoleonic, but is 100% a role-playing game, and maybe even a LARP, that Dave Arneson walked out of that session and said, that was a really cool wargaming session. Did he think of that as a war game? And I suspect, without confirmation, that the answer is probably yes. I have a stronger sense that Gary Gygax, who I did meet and did correspond with, would have thought of it as a war game at the time, when Dave Arneson took the road trip down to Lake Geneva to run the fantasy Braunstein for Gary and his buddies.
Yeah. I would suspect so, but I would also couch it as, what other term would they have used?
Well, that's the thing. I think I don't think this is restricted to terminology. I think for the first at least 3 to 4 years of role-playing games, everybody who was involved in this was figuring out what it was. And that is including Gary and his guys and Dave and his guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they necessarily knew how this thing was going to evolve over the course of those couple of years, not only with those closed groups, but as the community started to expand and we started to see different people who took different interpretations of those incredibly shittily written rules.
Yeah. It for folks that have never gone back and read the original first edition D&D rules,
don't.
You may think we are overstating the case, and I assure you we are not. about really how bad it was. A collection of notes that were shot out of a cannon. One of the things that I come back to quite a bit in talking with folks about things like Origins and the changes in the board gaming community overall. And we've even seen this going back through some of the history of the CSRs a little bit. Until Catan shows up, nobody's got a term or any language for the kind of deeper strategic game that's not a really shooty-bangy one. They're still considered war games of a different flavor. And you look at
whoa. Are you saying Catan is a war game?
No.
Oh, okay.
I'm saying that's the first one that people looked at and said, "Hey, this is a fairly deep. This is a deeper strategic game that is not, Monopoly, Scrabble, Sorry, the kinds of Milton Bradley crap you find at Target and Walmart. This gives me something a little deeper and a little more thoughtful that is not a shooty bangy sort of thing."
Or about war.
Yeah.
And to be let's be realistic here. For a lot of people who might otherwise become interested in war games, the fact that they are usually about war is a huge turnoff.
Yeah, but think about when Avalon Hill first published the Civilization board game, right?
Yeah.
But how did people think about it? Oh, hey, there's this war game that lets you start in the early years and take your civilization through all these times. Like the term 4X wasn't coined for another 7 years, 8 years, whatever it was when Alan Emmerich coined it in the early 90s in talking about PC games, talking about space games. That's when the 4X term first showed up. When you think about, it is possible to win a game of Civilization without ever firing a shot in anger. And yet it was still lumped in with all of the other war games. Diplomacy was lumped in with all the other war games.
Which predates Civilization by at least 30 years.
20, 30 years.
Yeah.
Think about some of those other earlier, not heavily shooty bangy sorts of. You mentioned at the start of this conversation, the Rome. It's sorry, I've
Republic
got
of Rome.
Yeah, Republic of Rome, because I've got the Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic on my shelf, and so I knew it wasn't that, but
I am golf clapping for those in the audience today.
Yeah. So, that's probably something that a non-war gamer would still enjoy, particularly the whole get up and give a speech kind of thing. But it's not, up until Catan and the other European imports started showing up, if you wanted a deeper, more strategic, more thoughtful game than, Sorry, Monopoly, Parcheesi, Scrabble, Stratego, you were playing war games because that's what you had. Or you were, maybe playing some role-playing stuff because that's what you had. The idea of the Euro game didn't exist. And so the Carcassones and Ticket to Ride and Race for the Galaxy and all these other things, Castles of Burgundy, like those didn't exist. And
the greatest thing about Carcassonne is that it can be played by a barely trained bonobo.
Yes, but it can be a perfectly enjoyable time waster over lunch someday with you and a couple of friends at the office.
Yeah, or to play with your not really gamer family at 9 p.m. on a Thanksgiving day. Fortunately, some of my relatives are in fact barely trained bonobos.
Wait, are they blood relatives or they marry into the family?
Both, actually.
Okay. Just checking. So the idea that what I think happened along the way, and again, totally anecdotal, no real data to back this up, somewhere in the late 90s through the early 2000s, roughly in line with WotC buying TSR and then third edition coming out, happens to be a coincidental timeline that I don't think there's a real causal relationship here. But that's the point at which you saw folks that might have otherwise played the war games that were a little less explicitly tactical, that found that strategic non-shooty bangy outlet in other places, and in places like Catan, Citadels, Bruno Faudetti, I can't ever pronounce his name.
Senegalio?
Right. No, Faudetti something or other, the Italian guy. He's the guy that designed Citadels, which
does Bruno Senegalio not sound sufficiently Italian to you?
Yeah, but it's not that one. It does start with an F. I'm thinking it's Faudetti for some reason.
Okay.
Somebody will correct me in the comments because I'm probably wrong.
Somebody will, and Wargamers love to correct you in the comments. They certainly love to correct me in the comments.
Yeah. So I think that he's the one that brought Citadels over, which Fantasy Flight had published in the late 90s. I know because I had a copy of it for a while.
I am peripherally aware of its existence.
Yes. And this was your chance to do some city building, realm building. This was a tabletop fantasy version of SimCity that you now can do this cool strategic realm building kind of thing without having to blow people up. And that may appeal to folks for whom the shooty bangy stuff isn't hugely appealing.
Personally, I like explosions and CRTs.
Sure. Yeah. Everybody loves a cathode ray tube.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that part of the expansion of board gaming as a whole involved getting away from the war games as the primary historical board game genre out there, even though we know that a lot of those air quote historical games are really a historical flavor slapped on a set of mechanics that you can use anywhere. And the fact that there's like 78 different versions of Carcassonne tells you that, right? There's Carcassonne South Seas, there's Carcassonne New World, there's Carcassonne the City, but you can find
Rickshaws of Catan.
Yeah.
Was an actual, I swear to God, was an actual product released by those people at some point. It was in the catalog.
Yeah,
there was a Catan catalog, an entire catalog of just Catan and its 1,017 expansions.
But how many different Catan maps exist for real historical places?
I'm not exactly a devotee of Settlers of Catan. I have played it, including not that long ago, and it's a good game. I mean, don't get me wrong, but it's just not really my deal.
Yeah, look, I'm a big 4X fan, and it's not my thing. So it's the idea that you can put historical stuff into a game that doesn't necessarily involve, a battlefield is relatively recent in the history of tabletop gaming.
Mm-hmm.
And let me back up. That doesn't involve a battlefield or a trivia contest. That is relatively recent. And that's, I think, where you saw a bunch of folks exit both TTRPGs and Wargames and say, I want to go do that, right? Because I'm not signing up for a 7-year campaign commitment for a role-playing game, and I'm not having to, fix bayonets and charge up the hill like I do in a war game. This lets me do something historical or at least historical flavored without having to, do one of those other two things. I think that's where a lot of folks that might have otherwise tried some war games ended up. I also think it's where a lot of people that never would have tried war games ended up. So there's that, over the last 25-ish years, we've saw that third path in the woods where you came up to the fork in the woods and you could go down TTRPGs on one side and war games down the other. There's some other folks that said, fuck that, and they started blazing a third trail, and that's where you get
the card game trail, and yep. Miniatures are still alive and kicking, and all that stuff. From a sociological standpoint, let's understand that the terminology that we apply to these things, role-playing game, war game, card game, collectible card game, customized, whatever, are labels, and language drift is a real thing. And we should not be shocked to find that the actual working definitions that people use on the ground of these terms is going to shift and evolve over time. It just is.
Yep.
None of us can stop this. This is a societal level thing. It is an inevitable fact about the way languages work.
Absolutely. No, and we're using a lot of verbal shorthand without necessarily trying to draw a lot of explicit definitions around things.
Well, we need to get John Peterson on here if we would like an academic discussion of this topic. Please invite me should you obtain him as a guest.
Sure. If. There's a big if in all of that.
Well, I would love to talk to him, actually.
Yeah, it'd probably be kind of cool.
John Peterson's works tend to be academic in overall approach. Plague at the World certainly is. So it reads kind of dry. But as somebody who has forced his way through multiple books on the Napoleonic Wars that were written before 1850, I was able to read it.
Yeah. Well, and the academic part of this does appeal to me, too, on a variety of levels, given that, that academic background that I have. Were that to be something that we were trying to do here, then sure, but we've been down that road.
This is not that show, folks, to be clear.
We've been down that road more than enough times that it's not worth, going back down again.
All of the brain cells that gave a shit about these definitional questions have been killed or anesthetized by Scotch. So I have no interest in engaging in these definitional arguments anymore.
The last thing I wanted to throw on the table, so we had invited Sam to join us tonight, and I guess time zones got in the way, and he wasn't able to make it because he's over in merry old England. But he had an interesting thread.
Was this Sam the Sham from Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs?
No, this would be Flintlock, who is Flintlock.bluesky.so. I mean, he's written stuff for us at the Dragoons before, but he's also pretty prominent on Blue Sky over on social media. He
likes Travelers, so we know he is a man of sterling character.
Yeah, if you follow him, be prepared for a heap and helping of left-wing British politics as well as a lot of gaming takes. I'm just warning people up front. But this is something that when you and I were talking about, hey, we should do this as an episode of the podcast, this actually popped up before you brought up this conversation. And he was saying, and this thread is linked down below in the podcast episode, so you can click through and go see it yourself. Thinking about the elusive shift and when it's recognized it happened and when it didn't. Put another way, when a new type of game was born as opposed to a variant of an existing type. So board war games versus miniature war games seems to be a parallel development is one of the things he says.
But board war games 1958, role-playing games 1974, and collectible card games whenever Magic the Gathering happened.
93. I
was going to say, it wasn't 83.
No, it wasn't 83. It was 93. Interestingly enough, I actually went back through the issues because I was curious. I went back through the PDFs. The first ad for Magic the Gathering in Dragon Magazine was actually not a WotC ad. It was from Wargames West, the old distributor.
I remember Wargames West.
So he's talking about skirmish miniature wargaming to skirmish wargaming is a variant of scale. Significance not really understood until later because of skirmish wargaming to RPG. Now we've got a new game type. In the modern age, RPG with heavy skirmish tactical combat generally gets seen as a hybrid instead of as a pure RPG. But at the time, that whole storytelling, character progression, character development kind of thing was seen as a new type of game. From RPG over to LARP, though, probably a new game type.
Dave Wesley might disagree.
Maybe. Sprawling war games to mega games describes as a new game type.
What is a mega game exactly?
So these are rarely done on a board. There's usually a heavy LARP component to it. One of the key features of the mega game, besides a big number of participants, like north of 20, is that you've got multiple subsystems all interacting with each other. So you may have these 6 or 8 people over here playing sort of a medical subgame trying to figure out the cure for the zombie plague, while these guys over here are more focused with keeping the zombie hordes at bay, while these guys over here are more interested in sort of the supply and logistics and scavenging and, hey, I've got to find the supplies for the medical guys to continue.
Guys, we're running out of room for zombie body parts here. I don't know where we're going to put these.
And they're busy, trying to scrounge up or manufacture the bullets that the shooters need to keep the zombie hordes at bay. And so it's a variety of interlocking subsystems that are all being played almost as their own miniature games that all connect with each other.
So would it be reasonable to connect this terminology with NSDM?
Maybe.
Because then I'll kind of know what you're talking about.
Yes, but if NSDM had about 6 times the number of people in the game.
Oh, okay. And probably more mechanics as well, I would imagine.
Yes, because where NSDM would focus on a high level of, hey, we've got this space race game going on. I happen to know they're working on a space race type of scenario, that if they're working on a space race game, that they've, instead of just everybody playing at the very high strategic level, they've got sub teams playing out. Okay, you're working on the science part of things. You're working on the public relations and marketing and messaging part of things. You're working on the astronaut recruiting and training side of things. And so
you are the astronaut, and you have just crashed the spaceship in the simulator again.
There you go.
Okay, so I get the picture. This does sound LARPy.
Yeah.
So is NSDM, quite frankly.
It is very LARPy, but usually with some pretty specific mechanics underneath it, rather than the sort of free form, almost free Kriegspiel attitude that LARPs sometimes have. The idea of going from RPGs to more narrative RPGs is more of a variant, because it's just a matter of how much emphasis are you putting on combat. So, because you can do narrative RPGs that have no combat in them at all, and those kinds of things exist. But that would be a variant of where the original RPGs grew out of skirmish wargaming.
Okay,
and so the idea is not necessarily. I mean, he's putting his markers down for here's where I think these lines are drawn, and I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I am saying that it's interesting to trace the evolution of where he is choosing to draw those lines, and his background is far more RPG than wargame. So he's coming at it from that different lens. But it's an interesting way.
Sounds like he needs a brief tutorial on the campaign for North Africa to me.
It's just interesting where he starts to see changes from, this is just a variant of this thing versus this is really kind of a whole new type of game where it's evolved far enough that we have a new species.
Yeah, and I having read that thread, or at least Sam's participation in it, I would broadly agree with everything that he is saying there. I think there are those three major breakpoints in like what we might call the adult gaming ecosystem. Seismic shifts, but we've seen some shifts of lesser impact as well, like the D20 crash and things like that. Or Wizards Zadok falling apart, and running off with the money.
Well, and there have been some very significant business issues that impacted entire categories of games.
TSR at the precipice of bankruptcy, for example, the anchor of the entire hobby.
Yeah.
And frankly, and SPI, right?
Yeah.
And Avalon Hill getting just kind of bought up and swallowed, never to be seen again by Hasbro.
Yeah, the late 90s CCG crash that wiped out a lot of stores. Took away a
number of publishers.
Yeah.
Including Iron Crown Enterprises.
And took away a lot of places that people had to play when those stores crashed. So there were some business decisions that had some pretty seismic impacts. One of the things that is linked to this Flintlock thread, and I'll have it down below this episode as a separate link. There's somebody who's done a lot of academic delving on the history of role-playing games and its growth out of more of the acting LARP side of things rather than the evolution from wargaming, and has traced these ideas way back into the Renaissance and even late Middle Ages as a variety of parlor games in which people were acting in different roles to try and accomplish different things within the course of the game. And so it's sort of, equal parts, how to host a murder and some wish fulfillment LARP stuff going on. There do not seem to be any really hard and fast rule mechanics associated with these things. It was almost sort of talking charades as much as anything else. But there's a lot of contemporaneous accounts of people playing these kinds of games that this person has unearthed and linked in this giant thread that really makes you realize the idea of playing a different role as a part of a game-like activity isn't all that new and has been around for quite some time. And I don't think there's really anybody out there that's looking at that and going, oh, Gary Gygax didn't invent the role-playing game because it was these other people back in 1562 or whatever. Like nobody's making that argument. But this altered persona adaptation or adoption within a game there are contemporaneous accounts of people doing this a long damn time ago, which is kind of cool.
Yeah.
Gary, we've covered a lot of ground in the hour and change that we've been recording this. Undoubtedly, we've missed something. Is there anything that we've missed that we absolutely got to squeeze into this episode here somewhere?
Well, I do have I do have an anecdote, as I often do, and this would be one of those connected to my pretty limited LARP experience. I did Vampire LARP a couple of times and a couple of things at Origins a couple of times. One of the things I did at Origins was we played a 1920s Call of Cthulhu adventure set on the Hindenburg, where historically a bunch of famous historical people from the period happened to be on the ship, like F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, for example, played by two people who were completely drunk the entire time, and it was great. 100% nailed those characters right there.
So hold on, the participants were drunk, or they played the characters as drunk?
No, the participants were drunk, as were the characters.
Awesome.
They had clearly fully understood the memo. I, on the other hand, was not drunk because I was playing Aleister Crowley.
Oh, boy.
And I was shaving my head at the time, so I looked slightly terrifying. And that was a whole lot of fun. At the end, the Hindenburg exploded.
As it should.
Yeah, well, it's A, the Hindenburg, and B, a Call of Cthulhu scenario. So either a bunch of people are going to die or everybody's going to die.
There will be a body count. The question is quantity.
Right.
And possibly means.
And you can only run away so far on the Hindenburg.
Yeah, no kidding, right? Did they have parachutes on the Hindenburg? Was that an option?
That pending further research.
Final anecdote from me. So again, moving around a lot, both, being in the military and growing up in the military, I've found the occasion to be back in Monterey, California numerous times over the years. It's the home of the U.S. Department of Defense Language School, where folks go to learn foreign languages on the government's dime.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's Presidio Monterey is the Defense Language Institute.
That's actually really cool. Do they have a tour next time I'm in Monterey?
There is a visitor center / museum down at the bottom of the hill, but it's not really a tour tour of the
language
facility of the Presidio. Yeah, it's a bunch of barracks and classrooms. I mean, it's like going to a college campus.
Well,
only the beds are made a little more neatly.
I could pretend to be a 18-year-old potential attendee.
I think the gray in the hair is going to give you away.
It might, yeah. And all the farting and general shambling about like an old stir with bad knees and a troublesome hip.
Yeah, there's that. So my dad was sent there twice, once to learn German, once to learn Russian. And then in the mid-90s, when I was stationed in California, I lived right near the Presidio, even though I was stationed about 80 miles south. The nearest housing area with space was up near the Presidio. Down at the bottom of the hill is where the Customs Plaza is, the old Monterey Customs Plaza, which is one of the first U.S. buildings in California. And Monterey was, at one point the capital of U.S. California out there at some point. So this is the original settlement of Monterey. And the big plaza out there right near the waterfront was the home of a vampire LARP for a good number of years. And so in the mid 90s, when I lived there, of course I'm shopping at the local game store, picking up my stuff and doubled as the comic book store, as many of them do. So I'm picking up my comics there as well, and found out about the vampire LARP, went down there one night, and a good chunk of the players were folks that were students at DLI, which is kind of cool. Except those folks are only at DLI for like a year at a time. I move away, I come back, 10 months later after I got out of the military, and that vampire LARP is still going on 5 years later. Again, people have been rotating in and out every year for however long, and there's a bunch of the locals playing also. Went back to visit some number of years later after my wife and I had moved to the East Coast, and that vampire LARP is still going on down Customs House Plaza on weekend nights. I imagine it's at this point it's the LARP of Theseus, right? It's like the original participants. I haven't checked lately because the last time I was there was 2 summers ago, and I was only there for a week, so I wasn't checking on the vampire LARP. I didn't care that much, but I'd be curious if it is still going now, almost 30 years later. I
wouldn't be necessarily shocked. I mean, there are certainly ongoing like gaming groups at like Ohio State, for example, that have been around. I mean, they're doing different stuff and with different people year by year, but that function is still happening there. So it probably is. I wonder what those people that bought the LARP house in Cleveland are still doing now. They bought a house to do vampire LARP, and I was never there for the record. Well,
not officially.
No, I was actually never. I was really curious to see because they had all the rooms decked out and painted black and with dark purple curtains and shit. Yeah. That had to be cool.
You weren't there under any ID that you're going to publicly admit to.
I may have been there wearing a false mustache.
Yeah. The reason I am curious as to whether or not this thing is still going on is that I know that the vampire fascination had waxed and waned over the years, and the Anne Rice flavored Vampire the Masquerade vampire sort of tailed off as the Twilight vampires became more popular. And then for a while there, there's about a 3-year period where the True Blood vampires were super popular. And so the types and variations of vampires kind of waxed and waned, but the underlying world of darkness setting that most folks set these things in kind of disappeared for a while into this tangle of IP wrangling, and then reappeared. And then, oh shit, we're misbehaving with this IP, so let's smack down the people in charge of it. It became a royal soap opera there for a while.
It did. I did not monitor it closely because
I didn't either. That's why I'm being very broad in my descriptions of it. But I wonder if that LARP was able to sustain itself without a regular batch of participants who have an underlying knowledge of the material available to refresh it each year, given that you've got the high turnover from the language school there in town, and the next year's crop of folks coming in, if it is during that 5 or 10 year period where the World of Darkness stuff is completely backburnered and nobody's picking any of it up, that you don't necessarily have a ready-made crop of participants to come help replenish the ranks.
Future show topic, the campaign of Theseus.
Yeah, there you go. I'm sure there's more than a few. So it's probably a couple of OCS games like that here and there, right?
Yeah, I would assume that there is.
Folks have rotated themselves in and out.
Or certainly those 3 people who have played Campaign for North Africa to completion must have had a similar experience too, as people say, I'm not, screw this, I'm out of here.
All right. I think we're going to call it here in part because we're probably taxing the audience's attention span, but also my wife is making homemade tacos tonight.
Ooh.
And just to clarify for the audience, when I say my wife is making homemade tacos, she starts with a bowl of masa, like the ground corn flour. That's the starting point for homemade tacos. And then at the other end, we have tacos.
Now, Brant, you have angered me because my wife is Mexican and I do not get homemade tortillas at home.
Sorry.
You punk.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure where they are in the process at the moment. I have not yet smelled them frying, so we're still a little ways off.
Oh, poor Brent.
Woe
is he.
I suspect there shall be some homemade tacos enjoyed tonight. I shall share photos on social media.
You should do that. I will make a slideshow as I express my rage on Monday night's Counter Clipping stream. Look at this stuff Brant's eating. Man, he's eating like a king over there. Or at least a Don or something.
Yeah. A minor princeling. There you go. So audience, I hope you've enjoyed. Look, if you're still listening to us at this point, it's probably because you enjoyed it. Either that or there are a lot of rage-filled comments.
Or because your commute is not yet over.
Or that you're stuck in traffic. That is entirely possible also. But we do appreciate you listening. I will also say, like we've mentioned a couple of places here and there. Hey, don't forget we've got our Patreon out there where you can support us. Gary's got his Patreon also where you can go support his channel. And I actually had to recut the Patreon supporters promo in the middle of our podcast episodes last week because we've added several folks at that top tier that we shout out by name in the middle of the episode. So
I will offer my services providing ridiculous voices for that voiceover should you require them in the future.
We can consider it at some point. McKenna's probably leaving the house and I won't have her to do them anymore. So right now I've still got her and her amalgamation of British accents.
She's doing a great job. I thought you had recruited an actual British person. Actually, I didn't actually know that was McKenna doing that.
Yeah, that was
bravo.
The one that was. It was.
I can't do a consistent English accent.
Oh
My
God,
English
I
accents suck. I can do German accent, French accent, Spanish accent, redneck accent.
I can.
British, it's all over the place.
I can do John Malkovich's Russian accent from Rounders.
Oh well, that's
what I can do.
My British accent, my French accent is modeled after Inspector Clouseau.
Fair enough.
My Middle Eastern accent is modeled after Jamie Farr's character from the Cannonball Run movies. So this is Character City, folks, and if you are going to be offended, this is a great opportunity to do so.
Yes. I will say that the one I was a little bummed didn't get more commentary was probably 2 seasons ago. We did a couple of different little Patreon thank you promos in the middle of the episodes where McKenna started doing the promo in a variety of different voices, and then I would interrupt her, and then we would go about doing it regularly. So she started doing one as Baljeet from Phineas and Ferb, and we had to cut that one off.
I have only the vaguest idea what that even is.
She started singing,
don't explain. It's okay.
She started singing one as like a Gregorian chant, and so I have to interrupt her in a singing voice to get her to shift back to regular. She started doing one as Stitch from the Lilo and Stitch Disney movies,
which I have heard of.
Yes. So we had a little bit of fun with the voices and nobody seemed to notice or acknowledge it. And so it was a little bit of a bummer that we spent all this time coming up with fun, wacky ways to do this and nobody seemed to care. So we've just stuck to McKenna and her British accent since then. So
and it's going great.
It's perfectly fine. This is about the 7th or 8th season that she's done this. And when it first started, I had a couple of folks ask me, hey, did you get, so-and-so's granddaughter to do this for, folks over in England? I was like, no, that's McKenna. So she's a theater kid. This is her thing. And she enjoys doing it. So we keep doing it. But yeah, we had to go recut the promo for this particular season because we added several Patreon supporters at that top tier, which are the ones that we shout out by name during the episodes. And so thank you very much to our supporters who have jumped on board and done that. We definitely appreciate that. If you do get a chance, pop on to whatever podcast platform you're finding us and give us a rating, give us a comment, leave us a note. We appreciate the notes on the episodes themselves because we like hearing the feedback from you guys and what you think of what we're doing. Even if you think we're nuts and we're wrong and whatever else, still, we want that dialogue, but especially on those other platforms, because those ratings and reviews, we just need more of them to continue to show up higher and higher in the recommendation engines as, hey, if you like this, maybe you'll like this other thing, and it helps other people find the podcast. So if you get a chance to do that, please do that. And And Gary's still got his shows Sunday night and Monday night. You're just
Indeed.
sticking with Sundays and Mondays at this point, right?
At this point, I mean, it's plausible that there will be a schedule change at some point in the not terribly distant future due to job things, but at this point, it is Sunday night, the Chit Show with Dan Pencaldi, and tonight we have superstar designer Herman Lutman on with us, and Herman is always a fabulous guest.
By the time you are hearing this, that was a week and a half ago.
Yes, indeed.
Or a week ago, or somewhere.
So check
around.
it out, folks.
It was in the past.
We will be updating you all on the progress of Golf Strike, Herman's most anticipated upcoming title.
Same Herman? Oh, Golf Strike. Got it.
Golf Strike.
Golf Strike. Fair enough. And so is that a not quite fully blinded sword system game? Is that a cyclopean?
No, this is some
game?
nonsense we pitched to Herman and he ran with it. Actually,
so this is a second cousin to you wrapping your final
This is combat golf.
So it's
which golf needs. Golf really does need a CRT. I think many of us will agree with that statement.
I think what
golf
needs is a nearby skeet shooting range. If your golf ball makes it past the skeet shooters,
that would work.
You can continue to play.
That would work. I would settle for occasional offshore artillery bombardment as well.
You know, the advantage to that is you can make whatever hole you want to be able to shoot.
That's true. That was hole in one again.
Yeah.
That's not a hole, it's a crater.
That's just a big hole. Still put a flag in it. Still aim for it. Folks, thank you very much for listening. We appreciate you being here. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Mentioning Dispatches.
See you, folks. Always a pleasure.